form. And finally, as he's seeking how to serve people and how to help people follow Jesus, he has a vision. And in the vision, an angel tells him that he is to go and open his home or open his shelter up to other people. And at first he rejects this vision, right? Part of the point of being a monk is being solitary, by yourself. But the message sticks with him, and he's convinced that this is a direct call, and so he builds a larger enclosure, which would be large enough for several people to live with him. And so he invites people into this new community, and he is devoted to helping teach them, wanting to help them learn to grow together in this new communal situation. Well, they all reject and pretty well abandon him, all of his students. And most of them, as far as we know, claim that it's because he was too rigid, he was too difficult, he was too strict. And he probably ended up expelling them rather than them leaving him. And so he probably kicks them out. And what he does is forms a second attempt at this sort of collective living. In this new attempt, he doesn't relax his practices of discipline, though. In fact, he becomes more rigorous. And so from the very beginning, he demands that any who wished to join the community had to give up all of their goods. They had to promise absolute obedience to their superiors. And they would all have to commit to work with their hands. Nobody could look at a specific task and say it was above them, they didn't want to do it, they wanted to focus somewhere else. Everyone had to be willing to pitch in and serve collectively. The basic rule for the community that he founded was service, so that even those in authority, in spite of an absolute vow of obedience, which all had made, were committed to serve those even under them. So the monastery that he begins to found actually begins to grow rapidly. In his lifetime, he actually has to expand such that he founds 9 communities with several hundred monks in each one. And along with that, his sister, who was named Mary, also formed similar communities for women. At that time, there were some in churches who felt that the institution of the widows and virgins was no longer necessary in the life of the church, and so many women left to join these monastic communities. And according to the witnesses who visited the region in areas around Egypt, there were actually in places twice as many women living and working in monasteries as there were men. And each of these monasteries that Pachomius founds had a set design. And so I remember they had an outline described. Bart Ehrman, who's a biblical scholar, described sort of the makeup of this, and it had a wide outer wall around it with one single entrance. Some of them, such as the storehouse and the dining hall and the meeting hall, were used in common by the entire monastery, but all of the rest of the little buildings inside were living quarters in which monks were grouped according to their responsibilities. For instance, there was a building for those who lived as the gatekeepers, and they were responsible for the lodging of those who needed hospitality and came to the community. They were also responsible for the admission and the training of those new people who showed up and desired to join. Other buildings housed people who developed skills such as weaving or baking or cobblers or so forth, and each of those individual houses had a common room with a series of cells, and every one of those cells had 2 monks in it. And the daily life of a Pachomian monk included work and devotion. And the devotional life was driven by Paul's expectation that we would pray without ceasing. And so the monks developed a habit of singing the Psalms and praying ritual prayers throughout the course of their day as they would go about their work. Twice a day there were common or shared prayers together, and in the morning the entire community gathered to pray. They sang and they read scripture, and in the evening they had similar services, but now they gathered in small groups in common rooms of those various living quarters that were sort of sectioned off by what your individual skill or gift was. The particular wealth or the economic life of each of these communities varied from place to place depending on where they were. Although all of them lived with a commitment to living in poverty, they didn't necessarily live in the sort of poverty that some of the monks that we had seen before lived in. They would go to these extremes where they would rid themselves of all earthly goods or ownership of all things. What the monks produced, the baskets or the different things that they made, were sold in markets that were nearby and paid for the necessary items in the food. And the sorts of things that they ate would have been bread and fruit and vegetables and fish, but the monks never would have eaten any meat. And in each monastery there was an administrator and an aide, and these people had regular accounts that they had to produce, which they of course were accountable to the other monasteries, and particularly the lead monastery where Pachomius resided. And all of these housing units, or all of these particular monasteries, had a superior that was the head of the individual community, and those individual leaders were called abbots. And when Pachomius was about to die, his monks vowed obedience to whoever he would choose as his successor. And so there was a custom established in these communities that each abbot would name the person to succeed him in absolute command of the entire organization. This new abbot's authority was final, and he could name, transfer, or depose all of the individual superiors within each of the communities were he to choose. And twice a month, these monks gathered for prayer, or twice a year, all of the monks in the various communities gathered collectively for prayer and to deal with any issues to maintaining their communities. The organizations of these monasteries were kept together by frequent visits by the abbot and his representatives. And so there would be the idea that the primary abbot, the Pachomius' successor, would travel around and check in the different communities. And similar to the way that the other monks wanted to separate themselves, the monks that went and fled into the middle of the desert wanted to separate themselves from the church, the Pachomian monks also resisted ordination. And so on Sundays, a priest from the church would have to go to the monastic communities in order to celebrate communion. The life in the women's monasteries was very similar. While each of those communities was headed by a woman, there was, of course, the male abbot from the original community, which was Pachomius' successor, which ruled over all of the different communities, and they were accountable to him. If you wanted to become a monk and join the community, all you had to do was show up and appear at the outside gate of the community. So there was that one single entrance. And the entrance would not be opened for you. You had to sit outside for several days and nights, and you had to beg to be able to join the community. And part of the purpose of this was to make sure that you were invested and sure that what you wanted to do was to belong. And so you could expect to spend several days and nights outside of the gates trying to beg to get in and to be received. And once you had shown the proper humility, the proper resolve, and the proper commitment, the gates were open to you, and the gatekeeper then took you in, and instead of you joining the community, you lived for a long time with the gatekeeper. And you lived and worked with the gatekeeper until it was decided that you were ready to join the community in prayer. And so you were then presented to the assembly of the monastery, and you would sit at a special spot until one of the houses either had an opening or a role was assigned to you that you would join in the ongoing life of the monastery. Now, part of the other reason for this elongated process of bringing people into the monastery is that they soon discovered that people were showing up at the doors of these monasteries without any Christian background. And so inside of the monasteries, they felt that there was a need for those who were coming to be taught the Bible, be taught the way of the church, the way of the monastic community. They had to be catechized, and then they had to be baptized. Now, this could mean one of a couple of things. It could speak to the sort of desperate nature of life in rural Egypt during that particular period of time in the 4th century. It could talk about the attractiveness of the way that the monks lived together in community and worked together in community and existed. But one of the things that they began to notice is significant portions of these monasteries, or people who were attracted to these monasteries, were Copts, or individuals who were descendants of the ancient Egyptians, who were people who were on the lowest echelons of Egyptian society. And so although these roots that sort of monasticism has, both in individual sort of ascetic life where people go out into the wilderness to be a part, and these sort of the roots of the organizing these communities are in Egypt, these things begin to spread across the known world at any given time, at this particular time in the 4th century. People from Syria, from Asia Minor, from Italy, Mesopotamia, all have this desire to learn from the monasteries in Egypt. And so we find pilgrims both going to and then returning from the Egyptian monasteries to elsewhere in the empire. And that's part of how we have some of the stories of Paul the Hermit and St. Anthony and Pachomius preserved, is because they were carried by these pilgrims who went back and established their own monastic lifestyles in different places. Throughout the eastern portion of the empire, and when we say eastern portion, again, we're sort of talking about the sort of Greece and Turkey and into Asia Minor, monks began to pop up all over the place, and some sort of lived that individual stoic, ascetic lifestyle where there were examples of monks who would return back and find temple ruins, and there was stories of monks going and sitting on a pillar in a temple ruin for the rest of their lives. But one of the things that happens in the church is that the others who didn't adopt such sort of extreme measures begin to inject into the church a sense of discipline, of dedication that becomes really important in this new church that has now been granted freedom under Constantine. Those who most contributed then to that monastic ideal were not those who sort of found themselves wandering off into the desert by themselves, but those who could devote themselves to prayer and meditation as bishops and scholars, people who saw the monastic lifestyle and routine as a witness to the broader church. Now, this is an interesting thing, at least to me, right? So you have the original monks who are reacting to sort of the excesses of the church under Constantine, the way the church is changing, and they flee the church. And the people who begin to integrate monastic thought back into the church are actually the leaders of the church, the bishops, the people who are scholars. And so in its earliest times, although Egyptian monasticism has existed, even in opposition to the hierarchy of the church, its greatest impact is made through members of the church's hierarchy. Several of those who contribute to the spread of monasticism were important, and we'll hear about them again and again throughout our talks here. But one of them is Athanasius, and he, besides writing the life of St. Anthony, which we talked about last time, repeatedly visited the monks in the desert, and when he was persecuted by the imperial authority in his life, he found refuge among them. And although he himself never became a monk, he became a bishop. He tried to organize his life in such a way that it would respect those ideals of discipline from the monastic life. He later becomes exiled in the West, which we'll discuss in a little bit. And he sort of shares with the Latin-speaking church and the communities the way of life that would reflect those ideals of discipline and renunciation. Jerome is another person who we've talked about and we'll talk about more. And he writes that story of the life of Paul the hermit. He also will translate Pachomius's rule, or the set of guidelines for the life together of the community, into Latin. He himself becomes a monk, but he becomes a scholar in the midst of his commitments as a monk. Since Jerome is probably one of the most admired and influential Christians, his works hold a significant place and have a deep impact on the Western Church. Basil of Caesarea, sometimes known as Basil the Great, is also a person who's found in the midst of all of the theological debates, begins to organize monasteries where time is given to devotion and care for the needy. In answering the questions addressed to him by monks, he wrote a number of treatises, while not originally intended as formal monastic rules, eventually become quoted so much that they serve that particular purpose. And soon the lands of Cappadocia, in what is central Turkey today, become populated with monasteries. One of the things that is a remarkable example of the manner in which saintly monastic bishops contribute to the popularity of the monastic idea is a guy by the name of Martin of Tours. And Martin is popular in both books and stories and paintings and imageries. There are statues all over the place of Martin. And Martin is born somewhere between, well, I've heard it as early as 316 and as late as 336. But he's born in an area of the world that is now presently known as Hungary. Pannonia would have been the name of the place at that time. And his father served in the imperial cavalry. He was a pagan soldier. And Martin becomes a Christian very young, and he does so against his parents' will. At the age of 10, he converts to Christianity, and by the age of 15, he has joined the imperial military again in the cavalry along with his father. He will eventually be moved in his military pursuits to an area called Gaul, which becomes France later. And during his time there, as he and his friends were entering a French city of Amiens, a beggar approaches him, a beggar that is almost naked, starving, cold, and asks he and his friends for alms. And what Martin does is he takes out his sword and he cuts off half of his cloak. And he gives half of his cloak to the beggar and puts on the other half of his cloak again. According to the story, later in his dreams, Martin sees Jesus coming to him wrapped in half a soldier's cape and saying, "Inasmuch as you did to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me." This story becomes so well known that Martin is almost always represented cutting his cloak in half. And so the picture there, of course, you can see he has sword in hand and he's chopping it off, but there's some variation of him doing that. The word that is used for the piece of cape, capella, became what we now call a chapel. Those who serve in the chapel are called chaplains. And it comes from that word capella and cape and is tied often to the story about Martin giving his cape to a peasant. Shortly after the incident at Amiens, Severus tells us that Martin was baptized, and 2 years later he finally is able to leave the army. He visited the saintly bishop, Hilary of Poitiers, who became a close friend, and several different tasks and vicissitudes took him to various parts of the empire, until finally he settles in Tours. And there he becomes a monk, or he devotes himself to the monastic life. And while the fame of his sanctity spread throughout the region, it was said that God performed works through him. He always, though, counts himself as nothing more than an apprentice in the Christian life. And so when the bishop position of Tours becomes open, the people of Tours want Martin elected. And the story goes that some of the bishops present at the election were opposed to Martin becoming the bishop of Tours, arguing because of his lifestyle, because of his monastic approach to life, he was always dressed poorly, and he was always dirty, and he was always unseemly and disheveled. And if he were elected, the bishop said that it would actually bring down the level of prestige that should be afforded to the position of bishop in the church. Okay, so you can kind of begin to sort of now see where the people who were a part of the early church went from being deeply persecuted under Diocletian on the edges and fringes of community, now within a fairly short time are beginning to see themselves as a part of the upper echelons of society, and someone who is dirty or disheveled should never serve as a bishop. And so, no agreement was reached when it became time to elect the bishop, and so as they went into services, they got ready for the reading of the scripture. And the person who had been assigned to read the scripture couldn't be found. He wasn't there. And so a person who was present took the book up, opened it, and began reading where it fell open. And they read these words: "By the mouths of babes and infants thou hast founded a bulwark because of thy foes, to still the enemy and the avenger." It's Psalm 8:2. And the crowd that was present took this to be a direct message from heaven, and Martin, the filthy, unseemly, disheveled man whom the bishop scorned, was now understood to have been chosen by God to silence the bishops. And so without further ado, Martin becomes the bishop of Tours. And Martin wasn't ready, though, still considering himself just an apprentice, right? He's got this approach to life and humility that he gained from his monastic exercise of life and faith, was not ready to give up his ascetic ways. He didn't want to give up being a monk. And so next to the cathedral, Martin built a small cell where he devoted all of his free time to the monastic life. And when his fame became so large in the city of Tours and the region that he could find no peace in his tiny little cell, he moved back to the outskirts of the city, and from there tried to carry on the pastoral duties and tasks of being a bishop. By the time Martin died, many people believed that he was a saint. And his fame and his example led many to the conviction that a true bishop acted like Martin. So, the monastic movement, which first began as a protest against the worldliness and the pomp of the bishops, eventually left its imprint on the idea that the bishop should be the opposite. For centuries, and in some quarters to the present time, it was thought that if you were to become a bishop, you should endeavor to achieve the ideal of Martin as much as possible, this monastic ideal. And in that process, monasticism monasticism itself was changed, whereas those who joined the movement, like I said before, and fled to the desert in the quest for their salvation, as years went by, would become an instrument for the charitable and missionary work of the church. Already in these early stages, the monastic movement had showed its ability to evolve and change in a multitude of directions. from the early anchorites, the early fugitives, that's kind of the meaning of that word, people who fled into the desert, evolved into large communities with hundreds of members, a movement that first eschewed books and ownership and all sorts of worldly possessions as excess, now turned into communities of scholars enrolled in learning and writing and teaching, and included thinkers like Jerome and Augustine and Basil. Originally a movement that was tended to reject much of life in the organized church, soon was embraced by the bishops, and eventually was the standard for the bishops. And this ability to continue to change through the ages would mean that in monasteries and in churches, you would end up finding teachers and preservers of ancient cultural traditions, scholars, and even some soldiers. And in all of this, there was a common thread, and that thread was the conviction that the Christian life was one of personal poverty and the sharing of goods. The earlier practice of Christian communities in general, the common sharing of goods among its members, now became a hallmark of monasticism, something to be expected of all monks and nuns, but not yet the rest of the church. And so there was a distinction between two levels of Christians, those which would continue to be marked throughout the rest of the history of the church, a distinction reinforced by the vows of those who were monks or priests, vows of celibacy and obedience, and those who did not take those vows. As the church begins to move on into the 3rd and 4th centuries, we begin to see divides in the church, early schisms, early debates that occur. While those who followed the way of life of the monasteries expressed their dissatisfaction with the new order, others simply declared that the church had been corrupted and that they were themselves the true church. Of several splinter groups that begin to break off, one of the most numerous early in the church were the Donatists. Now, the controversy that was wrapped around the Donatist movement was an instance where people were divided over the question of how those who had been a part of or lived through the persecution of Diocletian and lapsed in their faith could be restored. What happens when you have individuals who were Christians who were caught and brought before the imperial courts and recanted, and those who endured the punishment? Many people at this point still bore on them the scars and the marks of the persecution. The phrase that comes out of this area is saying that the martyrs have sealed their witness with their blood. And you have individuals also now who have, due to either fear or a new commitment to faith that they weren't deeply rooted in, ended up abandoning their faith and choosing to compromise and worship Caesar. And now both of these groups were figuring out how to coexist, because many people who had abandoned their faith wanted to come back to the church. Now, although there were similar issues and schisms in the East, it was mostly in the Latin-speaking West, with its emphasis on law and order, that these schisms were most long-lasting. In the 3rd century, there was a schism in Rome and in North Africa. Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, had to defend his episcopal authority against those who had held that the confessors were the ones who should determine how the lapsed were to be restored. And the confessors, the name of the confessors, were those people who had withstood the punishment and the torture. They were given the name confessors. So those who had held to their faith, many argued, should be the ones who get to say how you restore people back to the church, because they had lived through the punishment. and others were saying that it was the hierarchy of the church. The bishops should be able to make the decision as to how this should occur. And so in the 4th century, the debate over the restoration of the lapsed became particularly serious in North Africa. The persecution in North Africa had been incredibly strong. It had been violent. It had been just intense. And the number who yielded their faith was significant. There were a lot of people in the communities who turned on their confession of faith. And some bishops even avoided persecution by handing over to the authorities the texts that were a part of the Bible. Now, there were some who handed over the actual Bible texts. And then there were some who took the books that had been declared already on the fringe or heretical and gave those over and thought that maybe they could get away with that. But there was this sort of attempt to negotiate their allegiance to or association with the Bible. Others turned in, like I said, the genuine scriptures, and in doing so, they avoided their death. But the question was, is that yielding your faith? To turn over the texts to avoid being persecuted? Both the clergy and the lay, many of them succumbed to imperial pressure and worship pagan gods. The number of that group was so many that some chroniclers state that there were days when pagan temples during the persecution were filled to overflowing. And on the other hand, there were many Christians who remained firm in their faith, and they suffered, as I said, imprisonment and torture and even death. In Cyprian's time, some of the confessors had been too ready, in some opinions, to admit or readmit those who had lapsed without any consultation and without any thought. And so now, after Constantine's conversion, a significant number of confessors took the opposite approach, insisting that there needed to be significant testing, there needed to be significant rigor in choosing who would be allowed back into the church. These more demanding confessors claimed that the lapsed were not only those who had actually worshiped the gods, and this is important for what is coming in the Donatist argument, but they also said that anyone who had handed over the scriptures was guilty of such a great sin that they too needed to be joined in with the title given to the offense, or to those who had lapsed, which was traditores. It was the same sort of title that was given in the early church to Judas, the traitors. And so, shortly after the end of the persecution, the bishop of Carthage became vacant, and the election fell on a man named Cecilian. Now, he wasn't popular with the party of confessors that said rigor needed to be applied to those who would be brought back into the church. And so, that party elected a separate bishop named Majorinus. In these elections, there were all sorts of crazy intrigues. They were underhanded maneuvers, and people were trying to control the outcome of the election, and each group was justified, they thought, in claiming that their rival's election had been irregular. And so when Majorinus died shortly after being made the rival bishop of Carthage, his party elected a man named Donatus, who became the leader for about 50 years. And it's where the Donatist movement gets its name. Naturally, across the rest of the Christian world, this is a problem for the bishops in the church. It's troubling to think that there is such distress over who gets to be a part of the church in North Africa, and this problem has produced this sort of competing leaders in the city. The church began to believe and thought that it was only possible to acknowledge one of the bishops. And so the bishops of Rome and several other important cities declared that Cecilian was the true bishop of Carthage, and that both Majorinus and Donatus were usurpers. They were frauds. And this was such a significant issue that Constantine thought that he should get involved. And so he issues, because he was issuing legislation for, we talked about before, there were real-world consequences here. Part of the legislation before is that if you were a bishop, you didn't pay taxes, right? If you were exempt from military service, all of these different things were true. Now, if you had two bishops, which bishop had the rights and privileges of the imperial blessing? And which churches, then, under which bishops were exempt from taxes? And so he begins to sort of see the political trouble of having all of these different individual groups pop up. And so he comes down on the side of Cecilian. And he says that only those who are in communion with Cecilian are able to enjoy the benefits and the privileges of the empire that he was offering to the church. Now, the causes of this schism were outlined, and I will talk a little bit more about them, but they've been going on or building for a period of time. They didn't just pop up and happen immediately. It had theological, economic roots, political roots, and the justification of the schism had to do with the dealing of those, like we said, that had yielded to the persecution, but they said that, according to the Donatists, that one of the three bishops that had consecrated Cecilian as bishop was a traitor. That is, he had delivered the scriptures to the authorities, and therefore the consecration of Cecilian was not valid because he was not properly rejoined to the church. So there were three bishops involved in consecrating Cecilian. One of them was accused of handing over the scripture texts. And so the question then, one of the questions becomes, if a priest or a bishop is not absolutely pure, absolutely holy, is the sacrament or the thing that he enacts in the church moot? Now, why does this matter? It matters because the Donatists argued that the authority for him giving the sacraments and enacting leadership in the church rested in the role. And the Sicilian side, and Sicilian side of the church, the people who were against the Donatists said, no, the grace and the power of the sacraments and the power of the actions happens in the actions. Right? So it doesn't matter, they say, even if there was a traitor in one of the three bishops, there was still a valid consecration and ordination. This has impacts that run through the rest of the church, because if the validity of such an act is dependent on the worthiness of the bishop, then Cecilian and his followers would not actually be in proper communion with the church. They wouldn't be able to enact and receive the grace that is found in the church from their perspective. For in that case, all Christians would be in constant doubt regarding things like the validity of their own baptism, the communion that they had just participated in. If there is a question as to whether or not something can be found in the bishop or the pastor or the priest or the presbyter or whoever it is your participation in the church just moot because of the actions of someone? Since it's impossible to know the inner state of a soul, the soul of someone ministering the sacraments, there would be no way to dispel doubt in determining the sacrament's validity. So given these two positions, if a member of Cecilian's party had decided to join the Donatists, they would have required an entirely new baptism. The Donatists claimed that baptism that was administered by their opponents was not valid. But on the other hand, those who left the party of the Donatists and were to join the church led by Caecilian didn't have to be rebaptized, because the baptism was held to be valid regardless of the person administering it. Does the difference make sense? When you begin to actually hear churches, even today, talk about how they relate to each other, this still pops out. There are Christians who, if you go to a different church, will demand that they baptize you because the baptism that you got at your other church didn't work because of the quality of that pastor or the quality of their thinking and their theology, right? I know members of our church who have gone to other churches and they demand for membership that they get rebaptized to be sure that their baptism is valid. Where do you draw the line? How does it work? And so, besides the matter of the validity of sacraments administered by an unworthy person, the debate had to do also with two very different conceptions of the church. The Donatists held that the church, being the bride of Christ, had to be pure and holy, while their opponents pointed to the parable of the wheat and the tares, which suggests that it's best for the disciples not to try to judge who is holy and worthy right away, but rather to leave the judgment for the Lord. For one party, the holiness of the church consisted of the holiness of its members and its priests and its pastors and its bishops who gave it authority. And that was personal holiness. And for their opponents, such authority is derived from the office, which is a common principle in Roman law. These were the main theological issues involved in the debate, but when one reads between the lines of the documents at the time, one becomes aware that there were other causes of conflict that kind of become obscured. And so it appears that the Donatists, and among them, were some who had delivered the scriptures to the authorities, and even some who had made an entire inventory of all of the objects in the church used in worship in order to give that inventory to the authorities, and yet these people were still accepted in the Donatist groups. Furthermore, one of the first leaders of Donatism, a certain person by the name of Papirius, who had murdered two nephews. And so it's difficult to believe that the only source of sort of conflict was over the concern of purity. The fact is that the two parties separated along social and geographic lines as well. In Carthage and its immediate surroundings, Caecilian had strong following. But as they went further northwest into Numidia and into Mauritania, the Donatists were very popular. And a great deal of produce was being exported to Italy through Carthage. And so the result was that this middleman group in Carthage were less driven by labor and more by trade, and they were able to control the crops being exported. Furthermore, these areas that are out on the surrounding regions where the Donatists are located were much less impacted by Roman culture and law and ideals. And so many of the less Romanized areas also retained their ancestral customs and their languages, and they saw Rome and everything connected to it as an oppressive force. And so in Carthage, you have not just this conflict over theology, but you have these two groups that are kind of the rural farmers and then those who are in the urban settings, and they don't like each other anyway. And so they're fighting and arguing over something that first looks theological and sounds theological, but then also has to do with their sort of ethnic traditions and their careers and their roots and their sort of economic status. And so these are both driving at this particular conflict. The situation changes drastically when Constantine and the church the situation changes drastically with the advent of Constantine and the peace of the church. One could both be a Roman and a good Christian. Following the lead of the emperor, the Romanized classes flocked to the church, and others from the same social strata that had been converted earlier saw this as a positive development, but it was something which lower classes tended to see as a process of corruption in the church. And so you had these other sort of rural, less wealthy, less well-connected people watching the church become corrupted. And we'll start here, but I think we're going to end up stopping in the middle of this next section. And it has to do with the Aryan Controversy. From its beginnings, Christianity had been involved, like we've seen, in a lot of different controversies, but what ends up happening after the conversion of Constantine is that we see that it's possible to invoke the authority of the state to settle a theological question. And so, the empire had a vested interest in the unity of the church, and so Constantine steps in and begins to influence what is happening in the interpretation of the church. Now, I don't know if you're weirded out by that picture at all. That picture begins to sort of evolve in the Middle Ages, and I'll explain it, and probably this is where we'll stop then, is that there's a argument that begins to emerge over how to express the Trinity and how to talk about the Trinity. And one of the people who's leading this debate is a deacon by the name of Arians. And Arians is arguing over whether or not Jesus, or the Word, is the same substance as God. Is Jesus made of the same stuff as God? Now, why does this matter? Arians says that Jesus was created by God after the Father. Now, the way that this argument begins to work is that if Jesus is a created being, no matter how pure, how holy, how good the created being is, it is not equal with God. And so Arians would say that Jesus is a created being who is begotten of God, but is not the same thing as God. And so these pictures and art begin to emerge to express the uniformity and unity of Jesus and the Spirit and God being of one substance, of being of one being. And so it's the picture is trying to communicate this essence of the Trinity. And this is where we will pick up next week. Thanks.